the rest of you can, as the rest of you can see. I've given you what in old-fashioned terms is a handout. So just because I'm making an assumption here, which sort of experience suggests might be right, and that's that you know virtually nothing about human rights. I apologize if that sounds rude, but I thought it would be easier if I made that assumption. So this really is a sort of part of a longer term project which aims to connect the modern human rights project with gospel values and outreach. And I'm hoping that the human rights might prove useful as a tool for Christians, those Christians for whom Christian social justice teaching is an imperative. So the Franciscan charism is twofold. It's contemplation leading to action, leading back to contemplation. It's a praxis. And it's based, of course, on the Jewish Christian commandment to love God entirely and our neighbor as ourselves. So I'm going to examine how the notion of freedom, just in case you thought that had got lost, can be used in this context. So the title I've used, Searching for Life in Larger Freedom, is echoes a phrase from the preamble to the 1945 Charter of the United Nations, which you have in front of you. And that's repeated in the preamble to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the foundational document of the modern human rights movement, which you maybe have heard of. And the phrase life in larger freedom is one which has caught on, as you might say. It recurs, for example, in the context of sustainable development in the title of a 2005 report by the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, and subsequently in many other UN documents. And it might be said, I suppose, to encapsulate the goals of the United Nations, still, in my opinion, our best hope for international cooperation and action in a world which continues to desperately need both. So that freedom, life in larger freedom, might be viewed in two stages, as is mentioned in the preamble to the declaration, which you've got in front of you. So it might be freedom from hunger or torture, for example, and freedom to or for. So we might say to fulfill one's own potential. It's just a sort of catch phrase. And I put at the head of the handout a quotation from John. I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. And I'm translating abundantly into life in larger freedom. So the Human Rights Project can be seen as more directly relevant or useful to address the first question, that is freedom from hunger, torture, etc. Though, of course, the second's implied, which is why you have the quotation from John, and indeed the prayer that I opened with earlier. So I'm mainly going to concentrate on that first category, freedom from, and that on the assumption all the way through that enables the second. So, for example, as anyone would tell you, if you're starving, or more importantly, your children are starving, your freedom to, I suppose, not to worship God, but to have many other thoughts is somewhat constricted. In other words, the question of what is freedom for is a more theological question that, in fact, so yesterday I spent all day online, which was very enlightening, and we discussed what that freedom was for quite a few times. And so I thought, oh, this is more connected than I thought. However, so what's the link between these two disciplines, theology and human rights? And I think that some knowledge of the Human Rights Project and its foundation and its expansion as a movement might prove to be a useful tool for theologians in the 21st century. So that's why I'm looking at the link. This is sort of crusade on my part, which is why Nicholas looking at me like that. So it's not often that theologians or human rights advocates pay any attention at all to the connection between these two disciplines. But there is a longer history of interconnection here than you might suppose. And I'm going to explore that connection around this notion of freedom. So the first section is about that connection, the church and human rights. And as I said, the Human Rights Project has not historically enjoyed the support of mainline Christianity. In fact, sometimes, and in some quarters of Christianity, it's been openly rejected. But there are and have always been points of connection around particular topics. Anti-slavery, for example, work rights, the preferential option for the poor. And sometimes those connections have been made explicit, and that's happening more and more often. For example, in the series of papal encyclicals addressing workers' rights, and the clearly shared values of human rights with liberation theology and more centrally Catholic social teaching. And I'll look at some examples later. And Christians have always played key roles in major human rights developments, individual Christians. So we have William Wilberforce in the anti-slavery movement, Jacques Maritain in the drafting of the Universal Declaration, Martin Luther King Jr. in the fight for civil rights in the United States, Bishop Desmond Tutu in the struggle against apartheid. And at the same time, religiously based non-governmental organizations, including Franciscans International, increasingly work to advance human rights, sustainable development, and peacemaking. I was going to say world peace because it's kind of a phrase that seems to have developed. Anyway, more recently, such advocates as Pope Francis, of whom more later, and Anglican theologian and former Archbishop Rowan Williams have at least acknowledged that there are links between the two, and even gone as far as invoking human rights as a useful tool. Both of these systems are international, focusing on, loosely phrased, I suppose, the good of all humankind, and recently acknowledging that more clearly that that's to be seen as a part of the wider creation. Both seek that good through core values of equality, justice, peace, and the care for creation, and attention to relationships, responsibilities, and rights, for all of which a measure of freedom, both individual and collective, as we discussed yesterday, is required. So on the assumption then that some knowledge of human rights might prove useful to you in the future, I thought I'd just start with a clarification. And this is a word about rights and duties. So when human rights advocates speak of human rights, they're using shorthand for human rights and duties in a web of community and concern. Human rights as such would not make much sense otherwise. I'll say a bit more about duties later. But you do have people who say, oh, we should have a declaration about human responsibility. So there's your answer next time someone asks you about that. So there are a few words about the origins and precursors of modern human rights. Now, the term human rights is now at least easily recognizable, if often misinterpreted. But it was almost unknown before World War II, although, of course, many of the ideas and ideals which it articulates and reflects have long been part of many political and religious systems. In the anti-slavery movement from the 18th century, with its expansion of the then very restricted concept of human, an emphasis followed in the long campaigns for the rights of women, in collective action for the rights of workers in a decent society, first nationally and then internationally through the International Labour Organization, notably the first international human rights standard setting organization, which dates from 1919. It's also obvious in the development of public health systems and in early national charters or bills of rights in France and the United States, for example. So the concept of rights was not new. Indeed, it has a long history in law and elsewhere, but all these threads towards emancipation and inclusion come together in the context of the aftermath of World War II. Can I just ask you, as we started 10 minutes later, if I'm allowed to go up 10 minutes? Got that eye on the clock. Right. The Charter, which established the United Nations in 1945, though it was modelled on the League of Nations, was intended to avoid its diplomatic failings. But it was the revelation of the appalling treatment meted out to individual human beings, often linked to their membership of a particular group, which led to the prominence accorded to human rights and fundamental freedoms in that charter. I've put some of the bits of that long quote that you've got in front of you in bold, so you can see where I'm going. Emphasis was placed on our common humanity, on the fact that each human person is equally to be respected and accorded dignity, and that everyone has rights to such respect and dignity, even at the same time as they and others have duties. The recognition, acknowledgement, and delivery of such rights and duties was intended to usher in that better world towards which the United Nations aspired, and still does. Thus, it was human rights which were enshrined in the Declaration, the document which gave effect to the ideals expressed in the Charter. It was part of the package by which the new United Nations was to deliver development, peace, and security to the world. The Declaration is, yes, this is a bit of an odd sentence. The Declaration is in fact a declaration. That's two things should be noticed about that. It's not creating anything new. The rights listed there are already in existence. The Declaration simply acknowledges them. Secondly, the document itself has no legal effect. It is not binding in law on the states which adopted it. Instead, it aims to lay out for their guidance a moral framework which represents universal values. And that's the beginning of what I've called the Human Rights Project. And from this beginning, it was to develop in several directions. So the Declaration, despite contemporary scornful comments about it likely being totally irrelevant, has remained and developed as a universal standard and contributing to the ideal of a moral framework, and has spawned social and political movements, and more particularly provided the basis for a wide range of non-governmental organizations and civil society groups, and promoted activism in the name of human rights. Examples range from small local groups focused on one particular issue to large international NGOs such as Amnesty International. And those sorts of groups may employ a variety of methods, such as service provision, protest, boycotts, research, and policy development. But they may also make use of the expanding legal framework of human rights. And for the second development, which is stemmed from the Declaration, is a legal framework initiated at the international level and then extending to regional instruments and domestic laws and statutes. This international expansion begins with two covenants: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These two fundamental documents were drawn up to give legal effect to the Declaration for those states which agreed to be bound by them. And just a note for the theologians present, you might notice the use of the term covenant here, which is applied to these two human rights instruments only. These earliest documents concentrated on the importance of achieving freedom, dignity, and rights for individuals, not surprisingly given the immediate context after World War II. But it soon became apparent that emphasis on advancing the rights of individuals as members of disadvantaged and marginalized groups was also vitally necessary. Thus, employing the lens of anti-discrimination, there has developed a range of instruments to advance the rights, first of those denied equality on the basis of gender or race, then gradually to protect children, those with disabilities, migrants, Indigenous peoples, stateless and disappeared people. And that's happened in regional systems as well, including hesitantly in the Asia Pacific. It's probably important to note that these instruments don't add extra rights to those listed in the two foundational covenants. They simply explain and advise how these can be best adapted to particular circumstances and disadvantage. And all of them are focused on removing impediments or barriers to the enjoyment of that life in larger freedom, which is our focus today. International human rights law has also been of considerable influence in domestic laws and policies, in constitutions, bills of rights, legislation, and policy making. And sometimes that'll happen first in a local setting and then move out into an international convention, as happened with the rights of people with disabilities, for example. And sometimes, of course, it begins at the international level. But importantly, it is at that domestic or local level that the implementation of human rights has to occur, because that's where people are and where they need to be protected. But it is also, of course, at this local level where any clash or compromise with local history and culture has to be addressed. We discussed a bit of this yesterday in the online panel. So to give a pretty obvious example, what happens when you have, I'm trying to think of it, use an example that's not too controversial. What happens when the human rights system is faced with a culture which clearly disadvantages women? How do you resolve that question? So then the question arises, how universal can the human rights framework or the moral universe which it envisages, how universal can that be said to be? Now, of course, I could stop now and then we could talk for another few hours about universality. So I'm just going to say, this issue of the difficulty of how far to accommodate cultural difference without compromising universality is referred to in the human rights discipline as cultural relativism. And of course, in that context, it's been a matter of intense discussion in human rights circles for decades, and is of course ongoing, and it is ongoing, and it's one of those which changes, where the emphases change over time. And indeed, of course, it's a matter of intense discussion in Christianity ever since Paul left for Rome from Caesarea. I went there once, and it's just amazing. I thought on the coast at Caesarea and thinking, right, this is where we go out to the Gentiles. Anyway, so I'd be interested in your reactions to the question of the universality of the whole question of universality and how much it has to be compromised or not. Or, I think in Christianity it's got a reasonable answer, but this is not my area of expertise. And I said earlier that there would be a word about duties. Now, one of the commonest criticisms of human rights is that they privilege human rights over human duties, or even ignore duties altogether, and that it is duties which are more important in any moral system. But this is to misunderstand the nature of human rights, as I explained earlier. In legal terms, what distinguishes a right from a mere claim or a need is that some other entity is then charged with a duty to address that right. The Universal Declaration itself in Article 29, which is on your handout, states that everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. This was written in 1948, remember. Moreover, the international human rights system is designed to sheet home to member states obligations for the promotion and protection of human rights. And there are moves in the human rights community to expand those obligations beyond the original state-centric model to other what we call non-state entities, such as armed groups which exercise effective control, to businesses, particularly multinational enterprises. That's being met with some opposition, would you believe? And to the international community as a whole. Finally, if the very fact that everyone has rights means that we all have obligations to observe other people's rights. We talked a bit about that yesterday in our breakout group too. But you will say, or you might say, there are other impediments and challenges looming large to threaten the freedom of many, if not most, of Earth's human population. Unequal development, in inverted commas, between nations, a lacking of anything approaching peace in large areas, the threat of climate change. What, if indeed anything, can human rights contribute here? Now, these are all areas indeed where a human rights understanding and focus is growing by the day. And if I was doing this all again, we would start there and discuss all that, but I could talk about that in questions or send you some references if you're interested. So let us turn back finally to look at some examples where these two disciplines can be seen now to be drawing closer together. In other words, examples which demonstrate more clearly where human rights might operate as a useful tool for what are called social justice Christians. And the first of these is the concept of human dignity, which is central both in current human rights discourse and of course in Christian social teaching, and it provides a helpful link between the two but also it provides a connection for human rights to an underlying value system. The recognition of human dignity as grounding human rights is highlighted in both the Charter and the Declaration, as you can see, and has been reiterated repeatedly in subsequent United Nations statements. And in the Christian context, while the concept itself has, of course, a long history, its connection with and consequent validation of human rights begins to emerge more clearly during World War II, and perhaps its strongest and most influential expression in Pope John the 23rd's 1963 Encyclical Pacem in Terris. That's old-fashioned classical Latin, sorry, Pacem in Terris. I just reread that, which I hadn't read for ages, and I thought, crumbs, why don't we just start there? Because it's all full of human rights talk, and I just hadn't realised that. So there's been a sort of gap. However, the second example I'm going to give you, which is not very well known, is an example of long-standing cooperation between the Church and an international human rights organisation. So, since 1926, without interruption, there has been stationed in the International Labour Organization in Geneva a Jesuit in residence as special ecclesiastical advisor to the Director General on social and religious matters. Who knew that? Anyway, while there are examples of collaboration between religious and secular organizations, for example, on peace or development, and there are organizations which combine foundational values with practical outcomes, such indeed as Franciscans International. Here in the ILO, we have a Christian representative embedded within the circular organization itself. Now, none of this is to suggest that the Holy See and the International Labour Organization have always been in accord, much less that Catholic social teaching is to be equated with labour rights at the ILO. But it is an intriguing example of cooperation and mutual influence between two such different international organizations. One more weighted to moral principles, and the other to delivering their practical implementation, but leading at the same time to a sharing of values and objectives. The second example I was going to give is Franciscans International, which naturally I have an interest in, which is an international non-governmental human rights advocacy organization established in 1989, which has general consultative status with the United Nations ECOSOC Council. But in the interests of time, I will let you look that all up on their website. Just simply to say that their focus is advancing the cause of human rights, and particularly of marginalized communities in the context of United Nations decision-making. And Franciscans International combines two distinctive features. It has strong ties with Franciscans around the world. Franciscans International is Catholic and Anglican Franciscans. That's in not just third order people like me, but friars and people. And with Franciscans and their civil society allies who work at the grassroots with some of the groups that are most discriminated against. And its expertise is in bringing testimonies to the UN and translating them into strategic interventions to hold states and other actors accountable on human rights too. And finally, we have Pope Francis, 2 encyclical letters, which I have here. 2015, Laudato Si, and 2020, Fratelli Tutti. Now, again, of course, we could start now and have a whole session on either or both of those. In both of them, and especially in the latter, Pope Francis refers frequently, like all the time, more or less, to human rights standards and concepts, and refers to them as, in the context that I've suggested, that this is an international accepted set of standards which can be used as tools for social justice Christians. So I'm suggesting that when you go away from here, if social justice Christianity is your interest, here's a whole lot of things you might think about.